Hello students, welcome to a brand new episode of video lecture series conducted by Barakpur Rashtroguru Surendranath College. I am Sourav Bera, Department of History. Today's topic is assess the role of Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the socio-economic and cultural aspects of Bengal. Let's start. So today's topic is role of Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the socio-cultural aspects of Bengal. Let's start. Rabindranath called Ram Mohan Bharatpathik, who showed India her path in the modern age. Tagore said he was the only person in his time in the whole world of man to realize completely the significance of the modern age. He is called the father of modern India. His times were unstable, transitional, full of darkness. There was no discipline in state and society. A conflict between the old and the new was raging. The people were confused and directionless. In this transitional state of society, Ram Mohan was born. He opposed the old order and invited the new. His modern biographer Dilip Kumar Biswas called him Vishwapathik. He was the morning star of Bengal and Indian Renaissance. He was a universal man who believed in the unity of mankind. Max Muller called him in the first modern man of India as he struck a chord between the life waves of East and West. Ram Mohan stands in the history as the living bridge over which India marches from her unmeasured past to her incalculable future. He was the arch which spanned the gulf that odd between ancient caste and modern humanity, between superstition and science, and between despotism and democracy. He was the first cosmopolitan religious thinker and father of modern India. Ram Mohan was deeply imbued with the culture of the West and East, and was a scholar and reformer. He was a nationalist but had profound contempt for narrow-minded nationalism. In religion, Ram Mohan pointed to a universal inner spiritual synthesis far from external forms represented through meaningless practice. In pursuit of these religious objectives, Ram Mohan thought of a concreted action by a band of true reformers. His crusades against Hindu modes of worship rose in the orthodox and fanatical reaction against the reformer. Reformist propaganda was initiated through books, articles, and translations from the Upanishads. Bentham saluted him as an admired and beloved fellow worker in the cause of humanity. Now, Ram Mohan was the morning star of Bengal Renaissance. The awakening of the nation from the superstitions ambitions was felt in different aspects of the society. Ram Mohan's influence or direct involvement was felt in every aspect of social changes that metamorphosed the medieval mode of life in Bengal into the modern. Now, the early life of Ram Mohan. Ram Mohan was born in a wealthy family of Radhanagar in the Hooghly district of West Bengal. This family had the tradition of working as government officials. Ram Mohan received his primary educations in the primary school of his village. Thereafter, he went to Patna to learn Arabic and Persian. He learned these two languages so efficiently that his teachers called him Jabardast Maulavi. He went to Benares to learn Sanskrit, the Vedas, and Upanishads. Ram Mohan then joined the government service, went to Rangpur, and worked under William Digby. He learned several languages such as English, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. He studied Jainism, Hinduism, and Islam and tried his best to know the truth. He was extremely inquisitive about religion and religious truth. He started to live permanently at Calcutta since 1815 and founded the Atmiya Sabha. Now, what is his concept about Hinduism and universal religion? The inner meaning of Hinduism and Islam drew him to monotheism and created an aversion in him towards idolatry. With profound knowledge of Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and English, and with a deeper understanding of the philosophies of Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity, he became a rare intellectual of his time. He was in search of rationalism and felt resentful towards the prevailing socio-religious customs around him. Now, Raman's vision was broad enough to encompass various aspects of human life. His movement covered religious, social, economic, educational, political, and national issues. A Brahmin himself, he peeped into the inner substance of Brahmanical Hinduism to discover the existence of one omnipotent being. The ideal of monotheism was itself a supreme force in Hinduism, as it was in Islam and Christianity. Roy was highly critical of the outer forms of Hinduism, notably polytheism, worship of images, ritualistic ceremonies, and superstitions. Belief in one Almighty God is the fundamental principles of every religion, he said. Now, Ram Mohan realized that religious superstitions stood in the way of India's progress and modernizations. In his view, idolatry, priesthood, rituals, and customs were the potent reasons for Hindu decline. For this, Ram Mohan gave priority to religious reform. He deeply studied Christian scriptures, its morality and service impressed him. He was influenced by Islam's rationality and monotheisms. In his article, Tuhafat il-Muhaddin, he expressed his firm belief in monotheism and unity of religions. He got the idea of monotheism in Vedas and Upanishads. About karmafal, transmigrations of the soul, and the world after the death, he was not sure. To establish monotheism, he founded the Brahmo Samaj. It was open to all peoples of all faiths and creeds. He was against the caste system, but in real life, he could not free himself from all customs. In the Brahmo Samaj, only the Brahmins were given the right to read the Vedas. In order to prove that blind faith and superstitious beliefs and practices had no basis in the pure Hindu religion, Roy undertook the difficult task of translating the Upanishads into English and Bengali. He gave elaborate notes and comments with these translations and distributed them free of cost amongst the people. Raman fought against the superstitions which had resulted in evolving many inhuman and cruel customs and traditions in Hindu society. He tried to convince the people that the superstitions had nothing to do with the teachings of original Hinduism. Roy not only preached but also practiced what he preached. Traveling across the ocean was considered to be a sin by the Orthodox Hindus. Roy was the first Hindu to break this superstition. He himself undertook overseas travel. This courage of conviction on his part made Roy's efforts more effective. Now, being a champion of freedom and rights, Mohan was a great humanist and believed in cooperation, tolerance, and fellowship. Mohan established the ethical concept of universal love on the basis of the doctrine of ethical personality of God. He was also the exponent of cosmopolitan and stood for brotherhood and independence. He had begun with the study of comparative religion, but later come to visualize the necessity of universal religion. Finally, he formulated the scheme of fundamental spiritual synthesis, stressing the unity of religious experience based on the worship of monotheistic God. Thus, he carried forward the traditions of social and spiritual synthesis stressed by Nanak, Kabir, and other saints. Raman believed in universalism and regarded humanity as one family with the different nations and tribes as its branches. He was a humanitarian and universalist, and like David Hume, he also subscribed the doctrine of universal sympathy. Roy advocated liberal humanitarian nationalism, emancipation of man from the bondage for ignorance and social tyranny, his freedom of thought and conscience, and his equality with other fellow men were considered as the fundamentals of liberalism. Such free and emancipated individuals with feeling towards their motherland could create national unity. It was through a spiritual and mental revival that Ram Mohan wanted to regenerate the Indian people and unite them into a national fraternity. Now we will discuss Ram Mohan as a liberal political thinker. In the political thinking, he was an internationalist, Vishwapathik. He did not only call for the rights of his people, but the rights of all mankind. The peoples of different countries were part and parcel of humanity. He sided with the oppressed and exploited all over the world. The July Revolution of 1830 in France overwhelmed him. He opposed the autocratic rule of Spain and Portugal and supported the popular revolts in Naples. He supported the Irish freedom movement and wrote articles on it. He was very much pleased to see the emancipation of South American countries. He was always optimistic about the success of popular movements. Like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, Ram Mohan had a passionate attachment to the concept of liberty. He urged the necessity of personal freedom. Liberty is a priceless possession of the human being, and hence Ram Mohan was a champion of personal freedom. But liberty is also needed for the nation. Ram Mohan had a passion for liberty and equality, yet he showed his respect for property and believed in the freedom of contract. Indeed, he pleaded for state interventions in suppressing evil practices in society and held that it was the duty of the state to protect tenants against the oppressions of the landlords. Like John Locke, Thomas Paine, Roy accepted the immutable sanctity of natural rights. He believed not only in the natural rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of property, but also championed the moral rights of the individual. His theory of natural rights, however, was constructed in the prevailing Indian conditions. Thus, although an exponent of the theory of natural rights and freedom, he also advocated state legislations for social reform and educational reconstruction. Bipin Chandra Pal, while assessing the contribution of Ram Mohan to Indian freedom, wrote, Ram Mohan was the first to deliver the message of political freedom to India. Ram Mohan felt quite happy to hear the news of the introductions of constitutional government in Portugal. He supported the struggle for freedom of the Greeks against the Turks. Roy was opposed to the British occupations of Ireland. He collected funds for the relief of the famine-stricken people of Ireland. So freedom was the strongest passion of Ram Mohan's mind. He believed equally in the freedom of body and mind, so also the freedom of action and thought. He shunned all restrictions imposed by considerations of race, religion, and customs on human freedoms. Now, freedom of the press. Next aspect is freedom of the press. Ram Mohan protested against the Press Ordinance of 1823 and appealed to the British cabinet to cancel it. After his death, this black law was repealed. Ram Mohan's political thinking was striking similarity with those of the moderate congressman. He never talked the independence of India. He demanded administrative and judicial reforms. His demands included separations of powers, freedom of the press, and freedom of the individual. Now, the greatest contribution of Ram Mohan as a freedom lover is marked in the struggle for freedom expression in newspapers. The government promulgated an ordinance in 1823 to throttle the voice of newspaper. The law demanded that the publishers and the editor of newspaper should procure license ahead of publications. Ram Mohan wrote a letter of protest against this law. Now, Ram Mohan was one of the earliest champions of the freedom of the press, like I said before. Like Milton and other scholars who fought for freedom for press, Ram Mohan championed the concept of freedom of written expressions. Along with Dwarakanath Thakur, Harachandra Ghosh, Gauricharan Banerjee, Ram Mohan had written a petition in 1823 addressed to the Supreme Court for the freedom of press. When the petition was rejected, the appeal was made to the king in council. The appeal contained Ram Mohan's reflections on the government mechanism of the day. He strongly believed that not only would the freedom of press provide a device for ventilations of grievances, it would also enable the government to adopt steps for their redressal before they cause damage to the administrations. Like any other liberals, Ram Mohan also felt that the uncritical acceptance of British liberal values was probably the best possible means of creating democratic institutions in India. He appreciated the British rule as a boon in disguise because it would eventually transplant democratized governments in India. Now we talk about the social reforms of Ram Mohan. Ram Mohan is regarded as the father of modern India and Indian Renaissance. He was a social reformer par excellence. Most of the reform movements that have revolutionized Hindu society can be traced to his great son of India. Roy sought to articulate his belief in the Islamic notions of one God. In his conceptualism, social reform should precede political reform. For the former laid the foundations for liberty in the political sense. As a crusader against the social evils and unscientific and unhealthy practices prevalent in the traditional caste-ridden Hindu society, Ram Mohan formed a number of social organizations in North India. In 1816, he started a spiritual society known as Atmiya Sabha for religious and social purposes, which was later extended to the other fields of activity. Atmiya Sabha was sort of discussion club for scholars of religion and philosophy at other fields of activity. In 1818, he began his celebrated crusade for the abolition of Sati, and on December 4, 1829, Lord William Bentinck, the then Governor General of India, made Sati illegal by the Regulation 17. Thus, the year 1829 may be taken as an important landmark in the social history of India. Ram Mohan certainly won great renown by his crusade to free Hindu women from the dark of Sati. It must, however, be noted that along with the European Sanskriti, H. Wilson, Ram Mohan was opposed to any legal enactment for the immediate suppression of Sati. He favored that the practice might be suppressed quietly and unobserved by increasing the difficulties and by indirect agency of the police. His three papers, Sangbad Kaumudi, Miratul Akbar, and the Brahmanical magazine, were helpful in propagating his ideas. He believed that with the spread of education, these would be weakened. In the early 19th century, the government was not willing to intervene in such controversial social matters. But Bentinck was influenced by the liberalism. He consulted the Supreme Court, the police and army officers and decided to stop Sati. In 1829, he passed the Sati Act, which was supported by Ram Mohan. In England, he argued in his favor of the Sati Act. Not only Sati Act, he fought for women's rights, he also fought for women's rights, abolitions of polygamy, Kulinism and caste system. Now, the society was hidebound by Smritis and the Naya doctrines. There were several striking superstitions and evil social customs. The greatest social evil like I said, Sati. What is Sati? Now, the widow was burned along with the dead body of her husband. The missionaries of Srirampur collected huge materials on Sati and widowhood. The Sati custom was very much prevalent in the neighborhood of Calcutta. The Orthodox Hindus claimed that it was legal and supported by the scriptures. The young Bengal and the newspapers opposed these evil customs. At this very time, Ram Mohan launched his movement against Sati. He quoted Manu to show that it was not supported by scriptures. The Orthodox Hindus opposed Ram Mohan. He wrote booklets on Sati and distributed them among the people. Now, Roy fought against this practice of Sati on three fronts. The first and the most important was that of public opinion. Roy, through his writings, speeches, agitations, and discussions, prepared the minds of the people in favor of the abolition of Sati and explained how the practice had no support in any of the religious texts and hence governmental actions in the matter could not be an interference in religious affairs. Secondly, he tried to convince the rulers that it was their responsibility as civilized rulers to put an end to the cruel custom. The third front was the inquiry into the causes that led to a Hindu widow to commit Sati and to make arrangements to eliminate those causes. Roy found that ignorance of the women about their legitimate rights, their illiteracy, customary denial of the property rights to the widow, and the consequent helplessness, dependence, misery, and humiliation were some of the causes behind this practice. The most important event which brought fame to Ram Mohan was the establishment of Brahmo Samaj on 1828, which became famous of the abolitions of Samaj in 1830. After the failure of British India Unitarian Association, the followers of Ram Mohan felt the urgent necessity of establishing an institution solely devoted to Unitarian and monotheistic worship. The Samaj stood for the worship and adorations of the eternal, unsearchable, and immutable being who is the author and preserver of the universe, but not under or by other designations or little peculiarly used for and applied to any particular being and beings by any or set of men whatsoever. Now, other social reforms. Thus, Ram Mohan began the first great religious movement of the 19th century, since religion was the dominating force in Indian society. Reform of religion meant reform of society. The Brahmo Samaj thus a socio-religious reform movement. The principles and the ideas of Brahmo Samaj gradually spread for beyond Bengal and created an atmosphere of liberalism, rationalism, and modernity which greatly influenced Indian thought. As Max Muller has rightly pointed out, if there is ever to be a new religion in India, it will, I believe, owe its very lifeblood to the large heart of Ram Mohan Roy and his worthy disciples Devendranath Tagore and Keshav Chandra Sen. Ram Mohan's strongest objections to the caste system was on the grounds that it fragmented society into many divisions and subdivisions. Caste divisions destroyed social homogeneity and the integrated texture of society and weakens it politically. Caste divisions deprived the people completely of political feeling. Besides this divisive role of caste system, Roy was also critical about discriminatory nature. He was against the inequalities inherent in the traditional caste hierarchy. He thought it to be illogical to access the oath of an individual on the basis of birth and not on his merits. He was in favor of intercaste and interracial marriages, which he thought could effectively break the barriers of the caste divisions. Now, on women rights, Ram Mohan was a champion of women's rights in India. He laid the foundations of the women's liberation movement in his country. He revolted against the subjections of women and pleaded for the restorations of their rights. The condition of Hindu women in those days was very pitiable. They were subjected to different kinds of injustices and deprivations. According to him, the root cause of all the deteriorations of Hindu women was the completely denial of their property rights. The Hindu girl was not given the traditional right to share with her brothers the property of her deceased father. The married Hindu woman was refused the right to share with her sons the property left by her deceased husband. In 1822, Roy wrote a book entitled Brief Remarks Regarding Modern Encroachment on Ancient Right of Females. He pointed out that the ancient Hindu lawgivers gave the mother the right to have an equal share with her sons in the property left by her husband, and the daughter to have 1/4 part of the portion which a son could inherit the property left by the father. Roy, as equality of sexes was an article of faith for Roy, he could not accept that women were inferior to men in any respect. He believed that they were even superior to men in some respects. Whatever inferiority seemed to be on their part was the result, Roy argued, of keeping them away for generations from the sources of knowledge and the opportunities to shoulder different responsibilities in life. Now, on rights of the individual, Roy was the first to create an awareness for civil rights amongst the Indians. He was grateful to the Britishers because they made available to Indians all those civil rights which were enjoyed by the Queen's subjects in England. Though Roy did not specifically enlist the civil rights, he seems to include in the following rights: right to life and liberty, right to have opinions and freedom of expressions, right to property, right to religion. Roy gave the greatest importance to the right of freedom of opinion and expression. To him, it included the freedom of creativity, of mind and intellect, as well as the freedom of expressing one's opinions and thoughts through different media. Now, on law and judicial administration, Roy claimed was the creation of passionless reason. It was the common land of the sovereign. Hence, even the highest officers in East India Company did not possess the competence for enacting the laws for India. The king in parliament alone could have the authority. What is more, Roy argued that the English Parliament, before finalizing every piece of legislation relating to India, should take into account in the views of the economic and intellectual elites in this country. Roy had a clear perception of the distinctions between law, custom, and morality. He accepted that evolving customs were an important source of law, but two could not be identified. He also made a distinction between law and morality. Some laws, according to him, might be legally valid but morally indefensible. Conversely, some practices might be morally sound but could not be given legal forces. Principles of morality are relative to the social realities, and any law to be effective must take into account these ethical principles prevalent in a given society. He suggested the revival of the age-old panchayat system and thus argued several reforms and corrections in the Indian judicial system in keeping with the political liberalism. Now on education, Ram Mohan was a great scholar in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian and European languages. He firmly believed that education was the most suitable means for the transformation of society. After the foundation of the British rule in India, there was a growing demand for English education. Ram Mohan was in favor of the spread of Western education. It was necessary, he thought, for the modernization of India. The government proposed to found a Sanskrit college at Calcutta. Ram Mohan wrote a letter to the Governor General Lord Amherst asking him to make arrangement for the preaching of such useful subjects as grammar, mathematics, physics, biology. He was convinced that without Western education, India would go down. At the time of foundations of Hindu College, Ram Mohan actively cooperated, but the orthodox people opposed his inclusions in the committee. Alexander Duff received help and cooperations of Ram Mohan at the time of foundations of his institutions. But Ram Mohan never neglected the Eastern knowledge. He set up the Vedanta College at Calcutta to teach the ancient scriptures. He was able to inspire his people for a Western education. As a result of his efforts, several institutions came to be established. His aim was to create an educated intellectual community. He did not neglect the women educations, though he was extremely busy with reforming activities. Now on international coexistence. Thoughts of Ram Mohan on this subject are the expressions of his future-oriented imaginations and insight. He has portrayed a beautiful picture of international coexistence. He was perhaps the first thinker of the 18th century who had a clear vision of internationalism. This vision might have occurred to him in the course of his search for universal religion. Roy, the prophet of universalism, argued that all nations of the world must be placed on an equal footing in order to achieve global unity and a sense of broad fraternity. It is only then that the contradictions between the nationalism and internationalism can be ended. Roy held that the different tribes and nations were merely the branches of the same family, and hence there must be frequent exchange of views and frequent give and take in all matters among the enlightened nations of the world. This, according to Roy, was the only way to make the human race happy and contented. Now we talk about the limitations of Ram Mohan. David Cobb, in his book British Orientalist and Indian Renaissance, has neglected the claim that Ram Mohan fathered modern India. According to him, the new acting in Bengal and subsequently in India was due to the cumulative efforts of many Indians, not a single man like Ram Mohan. This view, though bears some truth, yet it is undeniable that the first glow of the new light was visible in Ram Mohan. In that respect, he is rightly called the morning star of Renaissance. Critics have raised many points of the objections showing Ram Mohan's limitations in several fields. A few critics have raised questions about the religious views of Ram Mohan. They allege that Ram Mohan interpretations of scriptures were partial and defective. His faith in one God, Brahma, was highly artificial and even communal in character. His interpretations of the Vedas was defective and asked for the criticism. In answer to these criticisms, we may accept that Ram Mohan's religious views were not perfect. Ram Mohan thought in terms of universal religion and was not a stickler to any particular religion or precept that people blindly follow word by word. Ram Mohan criticized Hindu superstitions, superstitious beliefs, as well as Christian tenets of miracles. Regarding his social reforms, though there was no lack of sincerity, Marxist critics find fault there too. They alleged Ram Mohan's social reforms suffered from self-contradictions. He did not utter a single word of protest against Hindu caste system. He was a critic of caste, yet he used to wear sacred thread, which was symbol of high-class Brahmins. Professor A. Sarkar has observed that Ram Mohan did not discard sacred thread to fear of social boycott. But this is hard to believe. A man like Ram Mohan would be afraid of social criticism. Ram Mohan was above caste or any religion. Ram Mohan wanted to reform society by remaining with it. He did not like the views of young Bengal, leave his people, and was converted to Christianity. His reforms were confined within the limits of his own familiar field, that is the middle class. The Sati problem, the problem of learning and education, religion were more or less confined within that class. Now we have discussed about the Ram Mohan's economic and political thoughts also. His critics have pointed some anomalies there too. Ram Mohan did never speak or think of India's political independence is another charge against him. We can answer these charges by saying that, being a realist, Ram Mohan knew that there was no chance of India's being free within 50 years' time. As such, he preferred the parliament to take charge of India from company's hands. In fact, Ram Mohan expressed his hope to such Europeans like Crawford, Jacob, that someday the enlightened sections of the middle class will be able to achieve freedom for India. He had deep faith in the power of the middle class, but he had no such regard for the strength of the common people. Ram Mohan's critics point out that Ram Mohan did not protest the activities of the indigo planters. He kept silent about infiltrations of foreign capital in India. Another defect of Ram Mohan's reform movement was it was too much urban and excessively dependent on the elite middle class. His reform movement was concentrated on the aristocratic sections of the society and did not touch the grassroots. He made a threadbare analysis of contemporary social and other problems, confirmed his stand by quoting original scriptures which appealed to people of his equal in status. Ram Mohan's methods were intellectual but never had the appeal to or response from the common classes. Now we have discussed about the Ram Mohan's economics and political thoughts. His critics, as I said, pointed out some anomalies there too. Although Ram Mohan was in favor of legal rights for the women in matters of property, but we have no indications in these works in the matters of property. But S.K. Dey, that a polygamist himself, according to S.K. Dey, Ram Mohan should speak against polygamy, culinism and practical selling of girls in marriage. Despite, we have talked the limitations of Ram Mohan, but despite all these limitations, Ram Mohan was a towering personality. He made an effort to open a new path for India, but was not completely successful. British liberalism and rationalism and utilitarianism he used to modernize India. His contradictions were the products of his age. For imperialism, India could not be ushered in a capitalist economy. The nationalists and the liberals see him as the founder of social reforms movement. The Marxists see him as feudal, colonist and bourgeois. Ram Mohan was an obviously rationalist and internationalist. He was the representative of the emerging bourgeois and with all his limitations made an earnest effort to modernize India. Thank you. আজকের ক্লাসে আমরা এতক্ষণ ধরে যেটা আলোচনা করলাম যে রামমোহনের অবদান, তার সামাজিক এবং সাংস্কৃতিক দিক থেকে রামমোহনের অবদান কতটা। যেহেতু এটা একটা বাইলিঙ্গুয়াল ক্লাস, তাই ইংরাজি আলোচনার সাথে সাথে আমি বাংলাতেও তোমাদের একটুখানি বলে দিতে চাই যে রামমোহনের অবদান কতটা এবং সেখানে তার কি প্রভাব ছিল সমাজ সংস্কৃতিতে এবং তার অবদান কতটা। এখন যে পিপিটিটা তোমাদের দেখিয়েছি সেখানে তোমাদের বলেছি যে রামমোহনের যে তার প্রথম জীবন কেমন ছিল, তো সেগুলো নিয়ে আমি আলোচনা করতে চাইছি না, আশা করি তোমরা বুঝতে পেরেছো। আমি তার যে ধর্ম সংস্কার সেটা তোমাদের একটু সংক্ষেপে বলে দিতে চাই বাংলায়। এখন রামমোহন আমরা দেখেছি যে প্রচলিত যে সমস্ত যে আচার সর্বস্ব, অনুষ্ঠান সর্বস্ব পৌত্তলিক হিন্দু ধর্ম বা বিভিন্ন যে সমস্ত লোকাচার ছিল, কুসংস্কার ছিল, পুরোহিততন্ত্র ছিল, সেই সবের বা তাদের যে আচরণ, সেখানে রামমোহন খুব ব্যথিত হন এবং তার এরকম বিশ্বাস জন্মায় যে হিন্দু সমাজের পতনের মূল কারণ হলো হিন্দু শাস্ত্র সম্পর্কে হিন্দুদের ভ্রান্ত ধারণা এবং তাদের যে সমস্ত অশাস্ত্রীয় যে সমস্ত আচার অনুষ্ঠান রয়েছে। বিভিন্ন ধর্মগ্রন্থ তিনি পাঠ করেন, যেগুলো আমি আলোচনা তোমাদের করেছি। এই সমস্ত ধর্মগ্রন্থ পাঠের মাধ্যমে তিনি একেশ্বরবাদী এবং নিরাকার যে ব্রহ্মবাদ, মনোথিজম যেটা বলেছি, নিরাকার ব্রহ্মবাদে তিনি সমর্থক হয়ে ওঠেন এবং এই হিন্দু বিভিন্ন শাস্ত্রাদি থেকে উদ্ধৃতি নিয়ে তিনি প্রমাণ করার চেষ্টা করেন যে এই সমস্ত যে পৌত্তলিকতা, পুরোহিততন্ত্র বা আচার সর্বস্বতা, এগুলো হিন্দু ধর্মের কিন্তু মূল কথা নয়। কি মূল কথা? হিন্দু শাস্ত্র মতে নিরাকার ব্রহ্মের উপাসনাই হচ্ছে শ্রেষ্ঠ ধর্ম এবং একেশ্বরবাদী হলো সকল ধর্মের মূল কথা। 1803 সালে তিনি বহু দেবদেবতাবাদের বিরুদ্ধে এবং একেশ্বরবাদের সমর্থনে ফার্সি ভাষায় একটা পুস্তিকা লেখেন, যেটার নাম হচ্ছে তুহাফত উল মুহাইদ্দিন, যেটা আমি তোমাদের স্লাইডে দেখিয়েছি। এবং 1815 সালে তিনি তার অনুগামীদের নিয়ে কলকাতায় আত্মীয় সভা গঠন করেন। এখানের মধ্যে কারা কারা তাদের সাহায্য করেছিলেন? দ্বারকানাথ ঠাকুর, প্রসন্ন কুমার ঠাকুর, রামচন্দ্র বিদ্যাবাগীশ সেখানে। এবং এরা কি করতো এখানে? তারা মূলত নিত্য বেদপাঠ করত এবং সেগুলোর ব্যাখ্যা করত। জাতি ধর্ম নির্বিশেষে সকল মানুষ সম্প্রদায়ের মধ্যে এরা সদস্য হতে পারত এবং সবার আলোচনায় তারা যোগদান করতে পারত এবং অংশগ্রহণেও কোনো আপত্তি ছিল না। বৈদান্তিক একেশ্বরবাদ শিক্ষা দেওয়ার উদ্দেশ্যে 1825 সালে তিনি বেদান্ত কলেজ প্রতিষ্ঠা করেন এবং পরবর্তীকালে একেশ্বরবাদ প্রচারের জন্য 1828 সালে আমরা দেখি যে তিনি ব্রাহ্মো সভা প্রতিষ্ঠা করেন। এখানেরও প্রধান উদ্দেশ্য আমরা দেখব যে পৌত্তলিকতা পরিহার করে নিরাকার যে ব্রহ্ম, সেই নিরাকার পরম ব্রহ্মের উপাসনা করা। এখন তার এই ধর্ম সংস্কারের মধ্যে আমরা দেখব যে তিনি কোনো নতুন ধর্মের কিন্তু প্রবর্তন করেননি। বেদান্তই ছিল তার যে ধর্মসাধনা, তার মূল ভিত্তি এবং তার প্রবর্তিত ধর্ম যেটা হলো যে বেদান্ত প্রতিপাদ্য একেশ্বরবাদ। শুধুমাত্র তিনি যে ধর্ম সংস্কার করেছেন এরকম নয়, আমরা দেখব যে 1820 সালে যে তিনি প্রিসেপ্টস অফ জেসাস নামক পুস্তিকায় যীশু খ্রিস্টের যে দেবত্ব বা তার অবতার তত্ত্ব ও অলৌকিকত্ব, এগুলোর বিরুদ্ধে তিনি তীব্র সমালোচনা করেছিলেন। শুধুমাত্র মানে যে হিন্দুদের কথাই তিনি বলেছেন এমন নয়, খ্রিস্টানদেরও যা কিছু তার মনে হয়েছে সঠিক নয় তার বিরুদ্ধেও তিনি প্রতিবাদ করেছেন। সমাজ সংস্কারের কথা তোমাদের বলেছি। সমাজ সংস্কার বলতে গেলে প্রথমেই তাদের বাল্যবিবাহ, হিন্দু সমাজে যেগুলো প্রচলিত ছিল, কুপ্রথা, বাল্যবিবাহ, বহুবিবাহ, তারপরে কন্যাপণ, কৌলিন্য প্রথা, জাতিভেদ প্রথা, অস্পৃশ্যতা, গঙ্গাসাগরে সন্তান বিসর্জন, এইগুলো বহুবিধ যে সমস্ত সামাজিক কুপ্রথাগুলো ছিল, সেই সামাজিক কুপ্রথার বিরুদ্ধে রামমোহন কিন্তু বিদ্রোহী হয়ে ওঠেন। এবং তার যে সামাজিক সংস্কারের মধ্যে আমরা দেখেছি যে সতীদাহ যে প্রথা, সতীদাহ প্রথা, তিনি সেটাকে কিন্তু 1829 সালের 4 ডিসেম্বর সতীদাহ প্রথা নিষিদ্ধ করা হয় বেন্টিংকের সহযোগিতায়। এছাড়া তিনি নারী পুরুষের সমানাধিকার, বিধবার পুনর্বিবাহ, স্ত্রী শিক্ষার বিস্তার, পুরুষের বহুবিবাহ রোধ, এই সব করার ব্যাপারেও তিনি কিন্তু উদ্যোগী হয়ে উঠেছিলেন। শিক্ষা সংস্কারের ক্ষেত্রেও আমরা দেখেছি যে 1823 সালে তিনি লর্ড আমহার্স্টকে লিখিত একটা পত্রে তিনি ভারতবর্ষে গণিত, প্রাকৃতিক বিজ্ঞান, রসায়ন, পাশ্চাত্য দর্শন এই সব শিক্ষার কিন্তু তিনি দাবি জানান। রামমোহন তার দেশের যে অর্থনৈতিক সমস্যা, সেই দেশবাসীর অর্থনৈতিক সমস্যা সম্পর্কেও সচেতন ছিলেন। কোম্পানি যে এদেশে যে একচেটিয়া বাণিজ্যাধিকার করছে বা লবণের ওপর একচেটিয়া বাণিজ্যাধিকার, দেশের পণ্যের ওপর কোম্পানির অধিক শুল্ক আরোপ, ভারতীয় সম্পদের যে বহির্গমন বা ড্রেন অফ ওয়েলথ যেটাকে বলা হচ্ছে, সেগুলোর বিরুদ্ধেও তিনি কিন্তু প্রতিবাদ জানিয়েছিলেন। এমনকি বাংলা গদ্যের বিকাশেও আমরা দেখি রামমোহনের অবদান খুব উল্লেখযোগ্য। তিনি প্রকৃত অর্থে কোনো সাহিত্য গ্রন্থ রচনা না করলেও হিন্দু ধর্ম সংস্কার এবং একেশ্বরবাদ প্রচারের উদ্দেশ্যে তিনি বেশ কিছু পুস্তিকা বা উপনিষদের বাংলা অনুবাদ এগুলো প্রকাশ করেন, যার মধ্যে বেদান্ত গ্রন্থ, গৌড়ীয় ব্যাকরণ, এগুলোও কিন্তু খুব উল্লেখযোগ্য গ্রন্থ। বঙ্গদূত, সংবাদ কৌমুদী, এই সমস্ত সংবাদপত্র মারফত তিনি বাংলা ভাষায় যে নতুনভাবে নির্মাণ কার্য সেগুলোই ব্রতী হয়েছিলেন। এছাড়া আমরা রামমোহনকে আধুনিক সাংবাদিকতার জনক হিসাবেও বলতে পারি। বিপানচন্দ্র তিনি বলেছেন যে রামমোহন ভারতের সাংবাদিকতার ক্ষেত্রে একজন অগ্রদূতের ভূমিকা পালন করেছিলেন। জনসাধারণের মধ্যে সাহিত্য, বিজ্ঞান, রাজনীতি বিষয়ক জ্ঞানের প্রচার, শাসক সম্প্রদায়কে জনগণের দুর্দশা সম্পর্কে জানানোর জন্য এই সংবাদপত্রগুলোর মূল উদ্দেশ্য ছিল। তার প্রকাশিত যে সমস্ত সংবাদপত্র, এগুলোর মধ্যে আমরা সংবাদ কৌমুদি, যেটা 1821 সালে হয়েছিল, ফার্সিতে প্রকাশিত মিরাতুল আকবর, যেটা 1822 সালে, এগুলো কিন্তু খুবই উল্লেখযোগ্য। এর পাশাপাশি আমি তোমাদের স্লাইডে বলেছি যে 1823-এ যে প্রেস অর্ডিন্যান্স অ্যাক্ট জারি করা হয়, সেখানে সংবাদপত্র প্রকাশের আগে পত্রিকার মালিক ও সম্পাদককে যে সরকারের কাছে লাইসেন্স নিতে হবে, এর বিরুদ্ধেও তিনি কিন্তু আপত্তি জানিয়েছিলেন। আন্তর্জাতিকতার ক্ষেত্রেও তিনি এক খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ভূমিকা পালন করেছিলেন। তিনি আন্তর্জাতিকতার যে আদর্শ, সেই আদর্শে তিনি বিশ্বাসী ছিলেন। ভারতবর্ষের তিনি প্রথম যিনি যে আন্তর্জাতিক যে ঘটনাবলীর গুরুত্ব, সেগুলোকে তিনি অনুধাবন করেছিলেন। ভলতেয়ার, হিউম, বেনথামের রচনা এবং আমেরিকার মুক্তিযুদ্ধ, ফরাসি বিপ্লবের যে আদর্শ, এগুলোকে তাকে গভীরভাবে অনুপ্রাণিত করেছিল। বিশ্বের যে প্রতিটি দেশের স্বাধীনতা, গণতন্ত্র বা জাতীয়তাবাদের প্রবল সমর্থক ছিলেন তিনি, এবং তিনি সমস্ত যে নিপীড়িত জাতি, সেই জাতির স্বাধীনতা তিনি কাম্য বলে মনে করেছিলেন। আমরা রামমোহনের বিভিন্ন সীমাবদ্ধতাগুলোর কথাও বলেছি, যে হিন্দু ধর্মের সংস্কার করতে গিয়ে তিনি যুক্তি নয়, ধর্মশাস্ত্রগুলির ওপরেই কিন্তু অনেক নির্ভর করেছিলেন। তিনি বেদান্তের ওপরে ভিত্তি করে সংস্কার কার্যে ব্রতী হয়েছিলেন, কিন্তু বেদান্তের যে ত্যাগবাদ, সেই ত্যাগবাদকে তিনি অনুসরণ করেননি। ইংরেজি শিক্ষা বিস্তারের পক্ষে বলতে গিয়ে তিনি সংস্কৃত ভাষা এবং যে দেশীয় শিক্ষা, সেই দেশীয় শিক্ষার প্রতি অশ্রদ্ধা কিছু কিছু ক্ষেত্রে প্রকাশ করেছেন। এছাড়া চিরস্থায়ী বন্দোবস্তজনিত কারণে কৃষকদের যে দুরবস্থা, সেই দুরবস্থার প্রতি তিনি সহানুভূতিশীল হলেও জমিদারদের অত্যাচারের বিরুদ্ধে তিনি তেমনভাবে কিছু বলেননি, বা নীলকরদের যে অত্যাচার, তার বিরুদ্ধেও তিনি সেরকমভাবে মুখ খোলেননি। এছাড়া তিনি অবাধ বাণিজ্য, যেটা লেজে ফেয়ার, অবাধ বাণিজ্যের সমর্থক ছিলেন, কিন্তু এর ফলে যে দেশের যে কুটির শিল্পের ধ্বংস হচ্ছে, সে সম্বন্ধে তিনি কিন্তু কিছু বলেননি। যদিও আমরা বলতে পারি যে ঐতিহাসিক সালাউদ্দিন আহমেদের ভাষায় যে তিনি ছিলেন একজন সতর্ক সংস্কারক, উগ্র বিপ্লববাদী নন। এবং অধ্যাপক ম্যাক্সমূলারের মতে যে রামমোহনই ছিলেন প্রথম প্রাচ্য ও প্রতীচ্যের মধ্যে যে জীবন তরঙ্গ, তার মধ্যে একটা তিনি সমন্বয় সাধন করেন। তো আলোচনার ভিত্তিতে আমরা তোমাদের এটাই বলতে পারি বিপানচন্দ্রের ভাষায় যে ঊনবিংশ শতাব্দীর প্রথমার্ধে ভারতীয় আকাশে রামমোহন রায় ছিলেন একজন উজ্জ্বলতম নক্ষত্ররূপে ভাস্বর ছিলেন। ঠিক আছে, ধন্যবাদ।